Progressive overload is one of the most widely recognized principles in training, but it's also one of the most misunderstood. While many lifters believe that they fully grasp the concept, common misconceptions often lead to ineffectual or misguided approaches. So, in this video, we're going to take a closer look at what progressive overload actually is, what it isn't, and the key nuances that can transform how you think about and apply it in your training. So, first things first, I want you all to just answer the question briefly of what you think progressive overload is. Take a second, maybe pause the video, and then return to what I'm saying. Most of you probably thought of something like progressive overload is lifting more weight over time, or progressive overload is getting stronger, or progressive overload is increasing any kind of demand over time. While these answers are partially correct, they overlook a really crucial detail here, one that can fundamentally change how you understand and approach progressive overload and training as a whole. So here's my answer to the question. Progressive overload is the process of increasing the magnitude of a given stimulus to promote continued progression. Put more simply, progressive overload is synonymous with progress. And this may sound kind of similar to the answers above, but there's a crucial distinction here that I think needs further explanation. So the answers above, the ones we just discussed before as possible answers, operate off of the flawed premise that progressive overload is solely proactive in nature. For example, when someone adds 10 pounds to their bench press from one week to the next, they imagine that they've just performed the operation of progressive overload, but that's really only part of the story. And this approach, generally speaking, leads people to arbitrarily add load to the bench press every week, thinking that if they could just continue to add load, that their muscle growth prospects shine brightly. But how many times have you seen someone try to use way more weight than is appropriate solely in the name of progressive overload, right? How many times have you thought that forcing more load onto an exercise was the obvious solution to your plateau? And how many times has that gone wrong for you or others? Right, so thinking about progressive overload only as a proactive process is clearly problematic, right? Because it assumes that progressive overload is something that we ourselves must force in order to promote gains. If we don't add more load, or so we think, then we undoubtedly won't make progress. Right? So this also assumes that progress won't be made unless more load is used in every session, every week. But anyone who's been lifting for several years or more knows that progress is slow. And so slow, in fact, that adding more load to an exercise may actually take several weeks. And that's okay, right? It doesn't necessarily mean you aren't growing or progressing. The goal should simply be to perform sets with high efforts and not to mindlessly add more load and hope for the best. So there's a really perverse truth here, which is that we can only ensure progress has actually been made if we've already made progress, right? It sounds kind of silly, but you can only lift more weight than last time if in fact you've adapted to that point. So by the time we recognize that progress has been made, progressive overload, by definition, is already something of the past. So it's therefore only possible to add more load once the progress we seek has already been made, right? Otherwise, how could we do more? How would it be possible to improve performance unless we've already adapted to a prior stimulus? Now, if any of that is confusing to you, or maybe it just sounds pedantic, like I'm playing a word game, think about it in another way. How is it possible for me to increase my bench press from 2 plates to 3 plates, right? 225 pounds to 315 pounds. Could I do it simply by crossing my fingers, loading up 315 pounds, and just pray to the progressive overload gods that, maybe bless me on that given day? Or should I only do what I can do every week with high effort and eventually work toward a point of benching 315? So hopefully the distinction here is clear. right? One need not bench press 3 plates in order to bench press 3 plates. One only needs to bench press lighter weights so that eventually 315 is in the cards. So forcing more load onto the bar is counterintuitively and rarely the answer to progress. Progressive overload is what opens the door to add more load. Adding more load in and of itself is not what demands that we add more load. Again, so if this just sounds like a word or semantic game to you, let me just give one more example to assure you that it's really not. So imagine you bench press, 100 pounds for 5 reps on the first week of a program. And now imagine you just continued to bench press 100 pounds every week for 20 weeks. Assuming that you're not totally new to the movement, or you're not, a world record holder in the bench press, which by definition you wouldn't be, you'd probably end up performing, maybe sets of 10 or 15 reps by the end of that 20th week. Right, so now imagine on week 21, you decide to add more load, say an additional 20 pounds for a total of 120 pounds. You'd likely be able to bench press that amount for 5 reps or more. So progressive overload has obviously occurred, right? On week 1, you bench pressed 100 pounds for 5 reps, and now you've bench pressed 120 pounds for 5 reps, assuming both are similarly difficult for you, but you never actually added load to the bar prior to the novel demonstration of strength, right? So in this instance, it's clear that your ability to add more load didn't come from any intentional manipulation of the load. It just came from sustaining high efforts over time. And more load was eventually required for you to maintain the same level of challenge for 5 reps that 100 pounds used to provide, right? That now 120 pounds provides. And so your need to add load was actually a reaction to your improvement in strength and potentially muscle size, right? It wasn't something that you proactively forced or manufactured. And this is really half of the perspective that most people are missing. Progressive overload, by definition, is reactive as much as it is proactive. So let me just briefly return to my original definition, and then I'm going to get to some really concrete takeaways that will actually help you in terms of my model of progression here. So again, just to repeat, progressive overload is the process of increasing the magnitude of a stimulus to promote continued progression. And the key phrase here is that progressive overload relates to the magnitude of a given stimulus being the key word, not the magnitude of a given load. And so, in other words, progressive overload should be thought of more as progressive stimulus or progressive stress. The term overload is kind of confusing, right? At least in the way it's commonly interpreted, because it kind of reinforces this idea that progress can only occur by adding more load to every exercise. So I think that one should more accurately associate the term overload with more of a colloquial use, like when people say something like, I'm overloaded with stress, or my schedule is overloaded, right? What overload refers to is not a single objective number on the bar that can be measured, or rather it's the process of necessarily imposing more stress than has been handled in the past to continue adapting. And put more concretely, progressive overload is achieved when we're able to perform more repetitions with the same load, or the same repetitions with more load at similar efforts. Now, this of course assumes that the exercises that we're performing are standardized in large part, right? We can't know that progressive overload has occurred if we change the technique we're using, if we swap exercises, or even if we just add more sets to our program. So while intentionally adding load at some point is an obvious necessity, it shouldn't be done randomly or with the assumption that the capacity to add more load, regardless of reference to prior performances, actually indicates real progress. And while adding sets to an exercise or improving technique, like better control over the weight or aligning the movement more closely with the intended goal, can certainly increase the desired stress, these changes alone don't directly indicate successful adaptation. So in this whole conversation, we hopefully can recognize that progress isn't solely determined by progressive overload, but rather that progressive overload is what we mean by progress, right? If progressive overload has been achieved, Therefore, we have made progress. So, a reasonable objection to all the things that I'm saying, and really the direction I'm leaning heavily toward here, is something like, how can I make progress unless I intentionally add load? Like, what am I supposed to do? Just to wait around until more load magically appears? And the answer is no. I'm not suggesting that you should just wait around for something magical to happen, but rather that the common misconception of progressive overload often leads to the mindless addition of load under the assumption that more load must equal more progress, right? But the process of training necessarily blends both these proactive and reactive behaviors. Lifters should proactively challenge themselves with some kind of structured progression, but the adaptations they experience, i.e., the progressive overload people experience, is reactive by definition. And so these two concepts, the whole proactive and reactive approaches, they're obviously not mutually exclusive. So while adding more load at some point is an obvious necessity, it shouldn't be done randomly, and it shouldn't be done with the assumption that the capacity to add more load indicates progress. Okay. So put more concretely, and now I'm going to sort of get into my own personal recommendations for how to navigate this problem. Master the load that you're using right now, right? Own 100% of the load that you're using. Control the weight and perform hard sets. And then, only once you've mastered a load, add more load when it becomes required to maintain the current level of effort that you're using. So here's kind of my overall framework for progression and progressive overload. And I'll just caveat this by saying that this obviously isn't the only way to do it. It's just a very reliable strategy that I've used and that many of my prior clients and pro bodybuilders that I know also use. Right? So pick a rep range. I think generally anywhere from 5 to 15 reps is a great option. I typically stick, within the 6 to 12 rep range, and pick a weight that allows you to hit failure or come close to it within the chosen range. Right? So if it's 5 to 15 reps, maybe I'll pick a weight where I fail at 10 or 8 or 12. It doesn't really matter. And then stick with that initial weight that you used on the first week of that exercise until you reach the top end of your rep range. And then only once you hit the top end of your rep range, add more load, and then simply rinse and repeat the process. So let me just give an example and show some visuals here because it might be a little confusing. Imagine week 1, you perform an exercise with 100 pounds for 6 reps, right? So 6 reps is kind of close to the bottom end of that rep range that I gave of 5 to 15. For the next, 3, 4, 5 weeks, I'm just going to continue to use 100 pounds. Maybe on week 2, I get 8 reps. On week 3, I get 9. On week 4, I get 11. 5, I get 13. And eventually, I get to a higher end of the rep range. Again, in this case, it could be 13 reps, 14 reps, 15 reps, 16 reps. The particular number doesn't really matter, right? But clearly, from week 1 to week 5, you've doubled the reps, right? You've clearly made progress as long as you're maintaining the same technique and the same relative efforts. And so on week 6, maybe I decide to add 5 pounds. So instead of 100 pounds, I use 105 pounds. And then by its very nature, because I've added more load, the reps will decrease, right? So automatically, I now move down to the bottom or close to the bottom end of that rep range. Let's say I hit 7 reps the first time I use 105 pounds. And then the following week, I get 9 reps, and then 12 reps, and then 14 reps. And oh, look, guess what? I've then progressed yet again to at least close to the top end of that rep range, at which point I add more load and the reps naturally lower, right? So standardizing the load helps me more easily track progression every week because the addition of reps make it much more clear that I'm making progress compared to the continual attempt to add more load, right? If we could all just continually add 5 pounds to every exercise forever, we would all be the strongest people on earth, right? And while I definitely don't subscribe to hard and fast rules, this general rubric I've followed for the last 3 or 4 years of training works fantastically. So I'll also add that I personally prefer to perform every set that I do to failure, so that I can be absolutely sure without a doubt in a very black and white sense about whether progress has been made week to week or month to month. Right? And there are many people who successfully prefer, to program with reps in reserve, right? Not going to failure, but close to it, which is perfectly fine. But just speaking from personal experience, I prefer to kind of remove as much guesswork as possible in relation to these objective metrics, right? So again, I'll just repeat that training to failure is by no means a necessity, but I personally love to do it. And I personally think that if you're an intermediate or advanced lifter, you should at least be able to train to failure often without the fear of injury, right? Like if you're scared you're going to get hurt every time you train to failure, you're probably using way too much load for what your current abilities are. Your technique is probably poor or inconsistent, and or your program design is just a poor fit for you. And of course, all of the above could be true simultaneously. So to sort of double down on my claim that this video is anything but a semantic game, I really want to just finish off by explaining what, practically speaking, an understanding of all of this means in the gym. And just to put it bluntly, understanding that progressive overload is a response to already made adaptations allows the lifter not to be foolish when training, and especially when progressing. Right? So instead of interfacing with the constant anxiety associated with adding perpetually more load to every exercise, the individual simply allows whatever is going to happen, right? Your priority remains control over the movement, and more load or more reps are only added when necessary to maintain the stimulus of high effort that you're already creating. So if I perform more reps with the same weight, awesome. If not, I simply just wait for a longer period of time to pass to see those adaptations expressed. And if you're training hard, if you're controlling all of your exercises really, really well, you're consistent about your nutrition and your sleep, progress more than likely is on the horizon, right? And this is anything but trivial, I promise you, right? The attempt to force progress as if it were ever something that could be forced is usually what gets people hurt. And the idea that one can force progress in the first place drives people to believe that they must add more load to the bar or else progress won't occur. But again, progress is inherently reactive. Progressive overload is reactive. Progressive overload occurs only in a circumstance wherein prior volumes and efforts were enough to allow you to lift more weight or perform more reps with the same weight than in prior exposures. Again, with all of those standardization caveats made. So just as a final takeaway, remember that adding more weight is not progressive overload. Now, adding 5 more pounds to an exercise performed with the same or more reps, with the same technique, with the same effort as the prior week or prior 2 weeks, that's progress. That is progressive overload. And it just happens on account of your effort. You don't make it happen. And progressive overload essentially just represents the adaptations that you've already made, not the ones that you hope to make in the future. So understanding this is really the difference between aimlessly throwing more weight on the bar in hopes of progression and putting more weight on the bar when it's obvious that you need it to continue making progress. So I hope this is clear and I hope it's helpful. I'll see you all in the next video.